want to thank Representatives Neal and Bamberg, not only for being here today, that's easy, but for their courage in standing up to powerful special interest, and for doing what very few elected officials do, having the courage to stand up for the least amongst us, the children who are not getting the education they need, the people who are sleeping out on the streets. So thank you both for your life's work. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, he was not on what we would call a civil rights march. He was in Memphis, Tennessee, fighting on behalf of sanitation workers who were ruthlessly exploited and underpaid. As many will remember, during the last several months of Dr. King's life, he was working on launching the Poor People's Campaign to dramatize the plight of America's poor of all races, white people in Appalachia, Mexican farm workers in Texas and California, as well as Black Americans in rural areas and in big cities across this country. And as Dr. King said at that time, asking a question, he said, quote, "Do you know that most of the poor people in our country are working every day? They are making wages so low that they cannot begin to function in the mainstream of the economic life of our nation," end of quote. Well, that was then, almost 50 years ago, and here we are today. Billionaires and Wall Street executives pour hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into the political process in order to elect candidates who represent the wealthy and the powerful. And the poor remain invisible, powerless, not heard from. Most don't even vote. So today I'm going to talk about, along with Representative Bamberg and Representative Neal, talk about what is in fact going on in this country and what we do not talk about, and that is the least amongst us. And the reality is that the United States today has the highest poverty rate of nearly any major country on earth. Yes, we are the wealthiest country in the history of the world, but we have the highest poverty rate of almost any major country on earth because almost all the new wealth and income is going to the people on top. Today, nearly 47 million of our fellow Americans are living in poverty, almost 15% of our population. Today, poverty in the African American community is over 26%. In the Latino community, over 23%. Native Americans, over 28%. White poverty rate, 10%. 28% of people with disabilities living in poverty. 10% of seniors living in poverty. You know, you judge a country, it seems to me, not by the number of millionaires and billionaires it has. You judge a country on how it treats its weakest and most vulnerable people. You know, that's what the Bible talks about. That's what every religion on earth talks about, how we treat the most vulnerable. Well, 21% of our children in this country are living in poverty, over 15 million children. 37% of African American children are living in poverty. 47% of Native American children are living in poverty. 1.2 million children in grades K to 12 were homeless in 2012 through 2013. Children in the United States of America. Now, once again, we don't talk about this much. Media doesn't talk about it much. Politicians don't talk about it much. Congress doesn't talk about it much. I'm in the United States Senate. I don't hear the word poverty talked about terribly much at all. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do to address the crisis of poverty? What we're going to do in this country, if I have anything to say about it, is to say that if somebody works 40 hours a week, that person is not going to live in poverty. Today, the minimum wage of $7.25 is nothing less than a starvation wage. We've got to raise that minimum wage over a period of a few years to $15 an hour. Today in America, women, often single moms trying to raise their kids with dignity, are making 79 cents on the dollar compared to men. If you are an African American woman, that discrepancy is much, much greater. Today in America, and again, we don't talk about this, real unemployment is not 5%. Counting those who have given up looking for work and are working part-time, it is close to 10%. And that is why we need to create millions of decent paying jobs. And the fastest way to do that is to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure, because Flint, Michigan is not the only city in America suffering from a crumbling infrastructure. When African American youth unemployment is 51%, you know what? We're going to create jobs and educational opportunities for our kids, not more jails. And when we guarantee health care to all people as a right, we take a huge bite out of poverty. Now, a lot of reasons as to why we have poverty in this country. There are a lot of approaches as to how you could deal with it. But I want to go back to one issue in 1996. And in 1996, there was a so-called welfare reform bill. It had a longer title than that, but that's essentially what it is remembered for. And what welfare reform did, in my view, was to go after some of the weakest and most vulnerable people in this country. And during that period, I spoke out against so-called welfare reform because I thought it was scapegoating people who were helpless, people who were very, very vulnerable. Secretary Clinton at that time had a very different position on welfare reform, strongly supported it, and worked hard to round up votes for its passage. And what that legislation was about was how we as a government treat the most vulnerable people in this country. I happen to believe we need welfare reform. But the goal of welfare reform is to get people to stand on their own 2 feet, to help them get jobs and the job training they need, to help them get the child care they need so they can go off to work, to help them get the health care that they need, not to punish the most vulnerable people in this country. Now, what happened as a result of that so-called welfare reform bill? Well, since that legislation was signed into law, the number of families living in extreme poverty has more than doubled from 636,000 to 1.6 million. Extreme poverty, the poorest of the poor, those numbers have doubled. The number of children living in extreme poverty has skyrocketed from 1.4 million to 3.5 million. Those are the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable. Those are the poorest of the poor, the children living in poverty. From 1996 to 2011, the number of households living in extreme poverty increased by more than 182% for African Americans, 132% for Hispanics, and 109% for white Americans. So, where we are today is to remember how we got where we are, to understand that in the richest country in the history of the world, we do not have to have children living in extreme poverty, that we need a government that represents all of us, not just the wealthy and the powerful. That's why I'm running for president.
Senator, a couple of days ago, you said that Secretary Clinton was stealing some of your policies, adopting your language, adopting phraseology even. And I wonder, since she's been talking about poverty, she's been talking about exploited children for years, maybe decades, can you be more specific?
Well, I am specific. What I am specific about is talking about a piece of legislation, a very important piece of legislation. It's a piece of legislation that I opposed because I thought it was going to hurt the weakest, the most vulnerable among us. And what the record shows, it did hurt the weakest and most vulnerable among us. Secretary Clinton supported that legislation. Andrea?
Senator, we're only a few days before the primary here. You're leaving for Super Tuesday state. I know you're going to be back in the election. But there is a feeling among some in South Carolina that you are writing off.
No.
I don't think that you can get the
No, let me just say, and I say that with these two guys by my side, and I thank them so much for their support. And I think media does this a whole lot, Andrea. We came to South Carolina, and if you look at the polls, we were like 7, 8, 9% in the polls. We were 50, 60, 70 points behind. We have waged a very, very vigorous campaign. We have picked up a lot of support, and we have closed the gap very, very significantly. But this from day one was going to be a very difficult state for us. We're not writing off South Carolina. Now, you all know that on March 1st, there are a dozen states that are holding elections. And the nature of the world is that we got to go out to other states. I think I'm leaving for Oklahoma in a little while, where we think we have a shot to win. We think we have a shot to win in Massachusetts, Colorado, Minnesota, and in other states. In my own state, I think we're 80% in the polls, so I think we're going to win there as well. But we are fighting here in South Carolina as hard as we can, but within the context. You know, I think Secretary Clinton was in California the other day. Doesn't mean she's writing off the state. That's the real world that we're living in. Now, let me just say something else. I hear this all the time. I was asked the funny story, and mostly I want to stay on poverty today. I know. See, we got off on this. When I was in Iowa, some bad poll came out. I was 40 points behind something. Well, if you lose Iowa, you're going to drop out of the race. So let me remind my friends in the media. Iowa is one state. New Hampshire is another state. Nevada is another state. Great state of South Carolina is another state. And you know what? There are dozens and dozens and dozens of states that follow. In some of those states, I expect we're going to do very well and win, maybe by large amounts. In some states, we're going to lose. We won New Hampshire by 20 votes. Not the end of the world for Secretary Clinton. There are states we're going to lose. But the race goes on, and this is a race where you got to get 2,400 delegates. 2,400 delegates. So we are in this race to win it, and I think we are going to pull off one of the great political upsets. Yes, Andrea?
Why do you think Democratic turnout is down, even in...
Let me say that. All right.
Because Donald Trump, it seems, has enormously expanded.
Let me say this.
Is that the real revolution?
Tell me about turnout. What we are being compared to is the phenomenon, which I said for a long, long time, of Barack Obama in 2008. Barack Obama broke the mold. The turnouts that he brought out were beyond belief. In states, they ran out of ballots. All right. The truth is that the Democratic turnout in Iowa was very, very good. Not as good as 2008. Compare it, I think it was the second largest turnout in history. Turnout in New Hampshire was actually very, very, very good. Not quite where Obama was in 2000. And remember also, when you compare just 2008, you had not only Obama and Clinton, you had John Edwards and other candidates, each one bringing out their own campaign. So if you want to compare turnout just to 2008, I don't think that that's fully fair. Go back to 2004, go back to 2000, we're doing pretty well. Now, in Nevada, did we have the kind of turnout that we wanted? Absolutely not. Yes, Nancy, one at a time.
Senator Sanders, you often say that you want to create the kind of political revolution that President Obama couldn't. Is the fact that turnout is lower a sign that that revolution isn't happening?
No, it's a sign that Barack Obama ran an unprecedented, brilliant campaign in 2008. Unprecedented and brilliant campaign, one of the great campaigns, if not the greatest campaign in the history of the United States of America, period. Now, we started off, in a lot different position than Barack Obama did. We started off at 3% in the polls nationally. And by the way, not that we want to get hung up on polls which go up and down or right or wrong, but